Hi. We continue in Genesis 12 today as the journey of Abram and Sarai and Lot begins from Haran to Canaan. And as you can see on the left side of the screen, it starts suddenly without any explanation or any reasons. Abram was 75 years old when he departed from Haran. Abram took his wife Sarai and his brother's son Lot and all the possessions they had gathered and the persons whom they had acquired in Haran, and they set forth to go to the land of Canaan. And on they go. And so many questions are raised about this short passage from verse 5 to 9, which we'll look at in just a moment. But before we do, just to situate us in the larger narrative context of what we're doing. We started after the genealogy of Shem at the end of chapter 11, we're looking at Joel Rosenberg's structural analysis of this whole story. And so I noted a couple of videos ago, this is not exactly a chiasm, but Rosenberg's trying to show how whatever sources the original stories might have had, the final editor put them into this kind of shape to fit them into a larger narrative. And as we go through the Abram and Sarai story and later the Abraham and Sarah story, we'll see how the older views of scholars that read this as like two separate stories, or maybe three, from three different sources, the priestly source, the Yahweh source, and the Elohim source, are being replaced by scholars who are seeing this more as a continuous narrative, whatever the sources might have been. So we're starting here with this migration from Haran, and it's matched at the other end with the migration to Haran, when Abraham will send his servant to look for a wife for Isaac. And we're also following this set of promises and responses. And so we saw in the first few verses of chapter 12, this invitation from Yahweh, the promise, and Abram went, as we saw. And the next promise will be in chapter 13. So we'll be following those as we go through. So before we look at the details, let's look at just some of the questions raised by Genesis. And I'm going to try to address some of these questions, but some of them simply are not answerable. The text just does not give us enough information to draw any kind of inference. So let's start at the beginning. How does Abram choose which direction to go, and or when to stay and leave from a location? In these verses, we see he's going to the land of Canaan, which was the destination that his father Terah had set out from Ur for, but had stopped in Haran, again for reasons we don't know. And then they came to the land of Canaan. But what does it exactly mean they came to the land of Canaan? We'll look at a map and we'll see that the land of Canaan is a wide category, and the word Canaan itself, Canaanites, is from Hebrew meaning traders, not traitors, but traders. So it's almost like saying Europeans came to Indian country. But of course that would be all the Americas. And so where exactly are we supposed to expect that they landed? And there's a logical entrance point, but it's not that it'd be signs to say entering Canaan. It was not a country in the way the modern nation state of Israel is a country with borders and guards. It's just a wide region referred to by others where a number of different peoples live, as the text tells us in the next verse. At that time the Canaanites were in the land. So we hear that he's going to pass through Shechem and the Oak of Moreh and various places, but why? Why is he choosing to go one place or another? We simply don't know. I miscolored this one, sorry for that, but after living for 75 years in a walled city, how are we supposed to understand he has gained the skills needed to live as a wandering nomad? Let's pause for that for a moment. He had been in Ur with his father, and as we looked at the Midrash a couple of videos ago that suggested, not based on anything within Genesis, of course, but on the imagination of the rabbis, that Terah was someone who carved idols of the Babylonian gods, or at least statues of the Babylonian gods. They wouldn't have called them idols, of course. And that young Abram was his assistant, apprentice, and was talking customers out of worshiping these things, and so they had to leave. But that certainly situates them in the urban context that Ur would have been. And within the Babylonian worldview, especially from Enuma Elish that we've looked at a number of times in the first chapters, the view would have been that entering into cities was a sacred place guarded by the gods, and outside the city was chaos and wildness, and don't go out there. So unlike city people nowadays who take vacations and travel and see the country and then come back to their comfortable urban locations, hopefully comfortable, city people in the ancient world rarely traveled. The only reason city people would have left cities is if they were in the trading business, merchants, for example, or soldiers. Otherwise, you would just stay home and rely on what the city provided for you and live within its structures and its ideology. So when he leaves, for reasons we don't know, but again, the Midrash suggesting he's not happy with the Babylonian worldview and looking for something else, skills are needed. Which one of you or me would leave our comfortable city places, assuming that if you're watching this on a video and you have Wi-Fi somewhere, you're probably in a city or close to it, at least a technological nexus, to just leave all that behind and go out and just start wandering around and find food and live and shelter and know how to do that in the hot desert places that he's traveling to? When I was teaching undergrads, I'd often ask them, based on a passage like this or the "Come out, my people" in the book of Revelation, if I suggested, let's just go and leave, or like in the Exodus story, as Moses calls the Israelites to leave their slavery behind and just go out into the wilderness, how many people would go? And of course, in the Exodus story, they go, but they immediately grumble. Where's the water? Where's the food? Why did you take us out here to die? Those are understandable reactions for people who've been in a quote-unquote safe place, even as slaves. But there's nothing here about Abram's concerns, or where he got the skills, or whether he's struggling to find food or shelter or the elements or the weather or any of those things. It just shows him going. Why does it seem that there are no other people around? We're told in verse 6 that the Canaanites were in the land, but we don't see any Canaanites. The only entity that Abram interacts with in these verses is Yahweh. And yet he's going around cities, the place at Shechem and these other places, and the tree at Moreh would have been a popular place to gather under. We'll look at that again in a minute. But no people are seen. It's as if he alone, without even mentioning Sarai and Lot, and if there are other persons with them, we'll look at that in a moment, whether that means persons or animals. Nobody else is mentioned. It's just Yahweh and the land and Abram. What might Sarai be thinking or feeling about all this? And if we want to write this off as, well, it's a patriarchal text, of course it isn't concerned with her. Up until now, we've only heard about men generating children, and we have not heard much about their wives. But very soon, in the next verses, Sarai will become a character. And later in this cycle and story, she will speak up, and Abraham will do what she tells him to do. So she's not going to remain a passive character. She has very strong views and will express them. And yet here, there's not a word about this whole gigantic adventure of leaving their comfortable, familiar place behind and just going out into wherever and not knowing where they were supposed to go. So it's a big blank of what she might be thinking. Let's look a little more specifically at some of the things that emerge from the verses, and then we'll go back. In 12:7, how does Abram know it's Yahweh who is speaking to him? I noted in the last video on 12:1, the readers, the audience, know Yahweh said to Abram, but Abram doesn't hear Yahweh. He doesn't say, hey, it's Yahweh, like Samuel does, or like Moses does at the burning bush, after he asks, of course. And yet, after the second appearance, again, the Lord appeared as only to us as readers. That's a narrator speaking. But suddenly, somehow, he built an altar to Yahweh. And how does he know it's Yahweh? We can answer all kinds of pious ways. Well, he just knew, or it was his experience, and maybe that's the case. We're supposed to imagine, but the text doesn't say anything about it. Also in 12:7, what does it mean for Yahweh to give land to Abram's seed when the Canaanites are already there? In other words, Abram has an experience of Yahweh saying to him, I will give you this land. But what does that mean? How will that happen? How will anybody else recognize Abram as someone entitled to land when other people live there, this stranger? It's as if some refugee showed up and his God told him, I'm going to give you North America. Or much like John Winthrop and folks, and the Pilgrims coming in believing, even though they were Protestants, accepting the Catholic idea that the church could give the land to people through the doctrine of discovery, just stands out on his boat and says, God has given us this land. But obviously the Pequots and others didn't quite see it that way. So we don't know how this intention of Abram's now newly connected to God is going to give the land, and which land, which this land. We're going to look at the pictures in a minute from Google Maps to see how confusing that might be. Is it just the land he's standing on? Is it the land he can see? How far would it extend? Later in the story, we'll hear more specifications, but at this point, we simply don't. Okay, so moving down to 12:8, where there's an enormous amount of detail here, and we'll look at that detail in a minute. Why so much detail? Why do we need to know about east of Bethel and Bethel on the west and Ai in the east and all that? Why are we being told all this little detail? And also, while we're in this verse here, what does it mean that he invoked in the New RSV, or in other translations, called upon, or others say worshipped the name of the Lord? To invoke or call upon is not necessarily the same as to worship, but what would it mean to invoke the name of Yahweh? Hard to know just from the text itself. And then finally, in the last verse we're going to look at, 12:9, why is Abram going to the southern desert known as the Negeb, which is really not in Canaan? It's south of Canaan, depending upon how one defines Canaan, which didn't have a sharp definition at the time. So many questions, and those aren't necessarily all of them. So let's go back and start back here and recognize the authors are plainly creating a text full of mystery, full of unknown intentions and unknown details, and allowing us, and it was taken up by the rabbis in the Midrash, to fill in the details using our imagination. So let's do some of that looking back and also using scholars' work as we go. So Abram took his wife Sarai, and notice it's compare the order to 1131. We can look at it there. Terah took his son Abram and Lot, and then Sarai. But now we hear Abram took Sarai and his brother's son Lot. So it's emphasizing that this was his nephew, but why he's there isn't clear. And all the possessions they had gathered here. The word for possessions here, rakusham, means movable goods. Some scholars think that includes cattle, but I'm going to suggest maybe it doesn't. Certainly cattle would be considered movable goods, but we'll see in just a second why that might be questionable. That they had gathered, the word here, Rosh Hashu, is first here, and it's only used at the edge of a major journey. So it's really suggesting pulling up stakes and gathering your stuff and going on the road somewhere. The word for persons here is nephesh, nephesh, and we saw in Genesis 1 that nephesh is used for all things that have the breath of life in them. So all animals are considered a nepheshim, the plural there, and we saw that in all these days of the first days of creation. It can also mean life in general at 1917. So it doesn't have to mean persons here. It could mean the cattle that they'd acquired. So it could be these are the non-living possessions and these are the cattle. Because if we hear it as persons, many translations render this as servants or slaves, or even incredibly misleadingly souls, a concept that Genesis knows nothing whatsoever about. So we don't have to think of them as slave owners at this point. We won't see that they have people until Hagar, and Hagar, the Egyptian, is going to be acquired, so to speak, in the next scene. Not yet. They haven't been to Egypt yet. So they may or may not have, we may or not be meant to understand them having servants or slaves at this point. And they set forth to go to the land of Canaan. And this is the first time we're hearing about the land of Canaan, and not again until chapter 31, where the story is restarted. Up to this point, Canaan was a person, the grandson of Noah, and a land connected with that, negatively. But that's all we know about it so far. So then when they arrive in the land, we see this series of wanderings here. I won't look at Westerman's note there right now, but note that the narrator focuses on Abram, that Sarai and Lot mentioned here are no longer part of the story. As I said at the beginning, the camera is really just on Abram and the implicit presence of Yahweh. He passed through the land using the Hebrew word. The verb to cross over is the Hebrew word, so he Hebrewed here. First time in the patriarchal narrative, it happened in the flood story, but not in the same kind of context. And it's relevant here because Abram will be called Abram the Hebrew by other people, which suggests they see him as a refugee or an immigrant, someone passing through, a migrant passing through their land. And that's exactly what he's doing here. He has no right to this land yet, despite Yahweh having said he will give it to his seed. But he didn't say, I'll give it to you. He said, I'll give it to the generations after you. So he really has no right to be here. We really need to see him as an immigrant, a refugee, a migrant. And to the place, the word makom, as Westerman notes later, can mean a cultic site. But the later has to do with Westerman's older understanding that Genesis patriarchal stories are narrating something that's related to the actual time of the story, not a time from the exilic time of the authors. And so by that time, certainly makom was understood as a sacred place. We know from Deuteronomy 16, for example, it's used many times to code for Jerusalem, the place where Yahweh will have his name, and using makom. So understood as a sacred place, and in this case, Shechem. But not Shechem necessarily is the sacred place, but the particular tree at Moreh that we'll look at. But before we do, we have to look a little bit at Shechem, and then in a minute we'll look at the map and look at the big picture. First of 67 times, and almost all of them are connected with the Jacob story, where it's an ugly, ugly story. The word from Hebrew means shoulder, named after the contour between Ebal and Gerizim, which again we'll look at in just a minute. And then the tree. The word is Elon. Oak is over-specifying the botanical species here. Terebinth is another possibility. And we don't have to worry about the kind of tree, the species, but the highlight is that it's a shade tree as opposed to a palm tree. And such a tree in the land that we'll look at in a minute, again emphasizing the desert nature of it, would become a sacred place because there's very little shade from the hot sun. That's one of the very things that made Babylon, or maybe it was Nineveh, as scholars are now suggesting, that had the famous hanging hanging gardens, a public cool space, much like Central Park in New York or Golden Gate Park in San Francisco or other such civic parks, that lead people to gather there and also to be grateful for the authorities that have built it and maintained it to give them some respite from the weather. So a tree like that would be considered a sacred place, and understandably he'd want to stop there, and we'll see him stop both here and at other trees later. And now this emphasis from the narrator, at that time the Canaanites were in the land. And it's really important that we pay close attention to this here. Again, we don't need to look at Westerman's view on my note below here. But what I want to focus on is the Canaanites being in the land suggests recollecting the stories in Joshua. And certainly the book of Joshua was written before the book of Genesis. Almost all scholars now see Deuteronomy and Joshua as written at the time of Josiah in the late 7th century, before the Babylonian exile, when Josiah was trying to consolidate the remnants of the former nation of Israel with the Jerusalemites to gather together and have Yahweh's strength in taking on the Babylonians, first the Egyptians and the Babylonians. That's ultimately not what happened. But the book of Joshua, as scholars suggest, was written not to describe an actual historical entering of the land in a war, but to justify Josiah's acts of violence against local people of the land. And so with that in the background, whatever we understand the book of Joshua to have come from, it narrates a story that would be understood by the audience, even though in the chronology of the Bible it happens later than this, to already be something they know about. And so Genesis is retrojecting an older time than Joshua, but for the audience, and certainly for us, it's a time that knows about the attempt to acquire the land by force, unsuccessfully. So what we're seeing the start of here is Abram and Sarai and their descendants entering into this already occupied land and not taking it by force. There is no Yahwistic command for a holy war against them. There's no command like in Deuteronomy 7 to destroy them all and make no covenant with them. And so Abram is free to negotiate whatever kinds of arrangements he wants. And of course, at the moment, it's just him and his wife and one person, so they hardly could be starting any kind of war here. We'll see a war in chapter 14, but it will not be a war of aggression. It'll be a war to recover Lot from the Sodomites and others who've taken him captive. So then we get the second experience of Yahweh appearing to Abram. The first one wasn't described as an appearance. And the word for appearance here, vayara, which is from the verb to see, but doesn't necessarily mean something visual. The word for vision can mean auditory as well, and there are a number of examples of that. Here are a few examples of it in Genesis. And as Kusuto notes, outside the land it was given to Abraham only to hear the divine voice, but here in the land he is also vouchsafed the privilege of a divine vision. But as my note down here below says, appearance doesn't necessarily imply visual phenomena, as we hear the same word described for Samuel's experience of Yahweh in 1 Samuel 3. So somehow there's a manifestation, an epiphany of Yahweh to Abram, who says, to your seed, to your offspring, one of many examples going back to the Garden of Eden of linking human fertility with the fertility of the earth. And this works in Hebrew as zera. Of course, it works in Greek also as sperma, as seed. I will give this land, and we already talked about the issue there. So he built there an altar. This is the first of his altars being built. I already showed a handout, a chart, and it's on the webpage of building in Genesis, so I won't bring it up now, but worth paying attention to who builds and who doesn't, especially in light of the Tower of Babel and this aftermath of that. Building a city in a tower or building an altar to Yahweh. We see the first of three uses of sham in here. I didn't make a key words passage as I've been doing for some other texts here because we're only looking at a few verses, but we can see there, and there, three of them here. And you can see all three of them if I missed one, three times, highlighting the specificity of it. He built an altar there. From there he moved on, and there he built an altar. There's all three of them. The altar here, there's only one before, the one that Noah built right after the flood, and we'll see some others in here. Again, the question of how did he know it was Yahweh to build it to? So then he moves on in this complex movement, and I'm going to show you all this, and then we're going to look at the map once we've gotten all the data to see what this might really be like. Then another from there, he moved on only a couple times used and indicating a continuation of a journey, onto the hill country on the east of Bethel. And Bethel here also invoking the whole Josiah issue, because Bethel was a town that Josiah destroyed just outside of Jerusalem, understood to be a rival to Jerusalem for gathering people to worship Yahweh. And so his whole quote-unquote reform in 2 Kings 23 includes destroying Bethel. But as we'll see later, Jacob's dream, where the angel comes down and he encounters the angels there, will be at Bethel. And the name Bethel means house of God, house of El. Elohim is God, not Yahweh is God. And so El could be understood as a local Canaanite god, and it was, but still a holy place. And it'll be important later in Genesis and throughout. He pitched his tent. So like Noah here invoking that, he has the skill somehow to know about pitching tents. And the word for tent, ohel, here is used a number of times. We saw it for Cain back there, and Cain's people, actually Cain's successors, the first people to live in tents, and then Noah, and now here. The essential label for a migrant living in their tents. And as you see in the book of Revelation in New Jerusalem, it says God is tented in their midst, using the Greek skene there. But that image of tent from Genesis to Revelation. With this very specific detail, Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. Ai, not a known place. It literally means heap of ruins, and scholars, archaeologists have tried to figure out where it might be, but have not succeeded in finding a local place for that. And there he built another altar to the Lord and invoked the name of the Lord, of Yahweh. And we see there's a little A-B-A chiasm here. So he built there an altar and to Yahweh, he built there an altar to Yahweh, in this little itinerary in the middle. And invoke the name of Yahweh. By Akira Bashim Yahweh. What does that mean? Walter Brueggemann suggests it means to turn to the one named as a single referent of life. Kusuto suggests he made proclamations concerning the religion of the Lord to the inhabitants of the land, and he got that from the Midrash. But there's nothing about that here. There's nothing about him speaking to anybody else. Perhaps we're simply to understand it, that he's calling upon God's name in the sense of thank you, Yahweh, for this, but we just don't know. And then finally, he journeyed on by stages, which is misleading here because it uses the word twice. We can see here that Venesova is the same word as journey. So he journeyed on and journeyed toward the Negev, which sometimes is translated simply as south. It literally can mean dry land. But when we look at the map, we'll see he's moved past Canaan now, on his way to Egypt. And he won't go directly to Egypt right now, but he will end up there in the next scene with a famine, already out of the land of Canaan, in it and out again. So having seen all that, let's look briefly at the maps, and we'll see a couple of ways to look at this. So from just the schematic map here, we see this migration here, and we see these places named. Note that in a later world, in the monarchical world, this is Philistine country, and we're going to see Philistines in Genesis. They don't play a big part, but he's wandering completely through Philistine country, although at this point Philistine names aren't on there because this map is suggesting a time period before the Philistines were in the land. But the Philistines will be in the story, so it's interesting that these people didn't. So let's switch over to Google Maps here and look at what this looks like when we look at the real land, not just a schematic map. And recognizing, of course, as we do, that we're looking at what it looks like now, or whenever Google Maps took these pictures, way different than what it would look like 2,500 years ago or so when it was written from exile. But I wanted to give you some sense of when Abram's entering this land, what the land was. So let's begin by looking at this map here, which shows the whole route from all the way from the top from Haran all the way back down to Beitan. And you can see from Google Maps 830 kilometers to go that distance. And it's pretty dry territory. Unlike following the Euphrates in the first half up to Haran, this is pretty trackless wasteland, and maybe that's why Terah stopped. But having heard from Yahweh, Abram keeps going. And you can see where he goes down near the bottom where the red tag is there. If we continue down to the Negev in the south, then you can see the green delta of the Nile there, where they'll end up in the next scene. So if we shift over to here, now you can see what Shechem, ancient Shechem, looked like a little bit, but now under the name Nablus, as you can see there. And we saw that Shechem was named Shoulder. So perhaps you can see here on that blue path that's being shown how the space there that makes it a shoulder between the mountain on what is the right side of the screen that you can see and that little valley on the left side. So passing between those places. Then here you can see the altar of Mount Ebal, which is the altar associated with Joshua, not with Abram, but it's roughly in the same place. And I wanted to get some sense of what the territory might have looked like if near Shechem, Abram is standing there on that first altar looking out. And if we look at it from a 3D perspective, here you can see in Google Maps 3D what it would look like when he hears that voice, the appearance of Yahweh saying, I give you this land. Note that when we're looking at it, we're seeing all the agricultural land in this Palestinian region, which would not have been there at the time, of course. There was agriculture in the ancient world, but not in the way it exists here. As far as we know, they didn't necessarily do terraced farming in this location. So it's pretty dry territory and pretty trackless, apart from those modern roads. How would Abram have had any sense of what Yahweh is telling him about, which this land he was being given there? And finally, we look at this one that leads down to what was Bethel, now Betin here, and you can see there actually is a place, Beit El, that's not on the blue path there. There's a little town named that, and we're not sure archaeologically of which exact of these places would have been. But you can see even all the way down to here, this is not exactly what we think is habitable territory. It's of course inhabited now, but that's because of the modern conveniences of plumbing and of global food supply that allows people to eat there, although there are a lot of poor people in this Palestinian territory. So that's at least a little range of the kinds of things that Abram saw in that territory. And as we saw from the map a couple of maps ago, we saw that the altar was right near a town called Elon Moreh, which is meaning Moreh tree in Hebrew, not like Elon Musk. And we can't see, of course, the original tree, but here's an image of a terebinth tree in Israel. So you can at least have some sense of what the shade would like and why this would be called a sacred place. There actually is a tree if we were to zoom in on that, but it's obviously a modern tree. So this terebinth tree, and we'll see another one specifically called a terebinth later, represents the reality of the rareness of a tree like this, that certainly in a hot climate people have wanted to huddle under. But Abram will leave this tree because a famine is coming, and so we'll see next time how they end up going to Egypt, going to another empire, having left Babylon, shifting to another empire, immediately looking for food. See you next time for that.